The Palace of Ashworth had always carried the weight of history in its stone walls, but on this particular morning, it carried something heavier, the silence after a decision that would divide a family forever. Queen Consort Isabel stood at the tall window of her private chamber, watching the gray clouds roll over the palace gardens. She had read the announcement twice, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. They hadn't. Prince Alexander, heir to the throne, had just informed the nation that her role in his future reign would be quietly but permanently reduced. King Edmund sat in his study, the same announcement folded neatly on his desk. He hadn't called his son. He hadn't called his wife. He simply sat, staring at the fire, caught between the woman he loved and the son who would carry the crown long after he was gone. The king understood something few outside the palace walls ever grasped, that monarchy survives not on affection, but on symbols. And Alexander had just rewritten one of the most important symbols in the kingdom. This was not merely a family disagreement. It was the quiet reshaping of a dynasty's future, and it had been building for months. Weeks earlier, inside the private halls of Ravenscourt Castle, the family had gathered for what was meant to be a routine succession rehearsal, a private run-through of ceremonial seating, household roles, and the delicate architecture of who would stand where when Alexander eventually became king. It was meant to be procedural. It became personal. Isabel, seated near the head of the table, raised an objection. She questioned why Princess Eleanor, Alexander's wife, had been named first representative in the future coronation household plan. It was a small phrase on paper, but it carried enormous weight. Whoever held that position would stand closest to the throne in the years to come. The room went still. King Edmund looked away, unwilling to referee between his wife and his son's decisions. Eleanor said nothing, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed what her composure hid. And Alexander, watching his father avoid his eyes and his wife absorb the insult without complaint, understood in that single moment that his reign could not begin while old rivalries still held the door open. He had walked into that rehearsal expecting formality. He left it carrying a decision he hadn't wanted to make. Isabel pressed further. She asked for written assurance, an official promise, that she would retain ceremonial influence once Alexander took the throne. It was a reasonable request from her perspective. She had spent over a decade proving her place in a family that had never fully embraced her. But to Alexander, it sounded like something else entirely, an attempt to lock in influence before he'd even had the chance to define his own reign. He pushed his chair back, not in anger, but in resolve. This was no longer about a single seat at a ceremony. It was about whether his future monarchy would begin under the shadow of unresolved family tension, or whether he would finally take control of his own story. A senior court advisor placed a confidential memo on Alexander's desk soon after, a private document outlining future role boundaries for the royal household. Once King Edmund saw it, the matter could no longer stay buried inside Ravenscourt's private chambers. What had started as a disagreement over a seating chart was becoming a formal, undeniable decision. The confrontation that followed didn't happen in front of cameras or advisors. It happened in a quiet drawing room at Clareford House, Isabel and Edmund's private residence, the one place that was supposed to feel safe from judgment. William stood near the window. Isabel stood near the door. Edmund sat between them, a man watching two futures collide without knowing how to stop it. No voices were raised. The damage had already entered the room before a single word was spoken. Alexander told her plainly that her future influence in his reign would be limited. Isabel's grip tightened on the back of a chair, as though the floor itself had shifted. She asked if Eleanor had requested this. Alexander answered without hesitation. The decision was his, and his alone. She turned to Edmund, silently asking him to defend her. He didn't. He looked at his son, then at the floor. In that small, quiet movement, she understood she had already lost this particular battle, not because anyone had raised their voice, but because no one had raised it for her. The most important conversation of this entire crisis happened away from advisors, away from documents, away from prepared statements. Alexander came to see his father not as a prince seeking approval, but as a son carrying a decision that had wounded the people he loved. Edmund didn't greet him with anger. He simply gestured to the chair across from him. He told Alexander that Isabel felt publicly diminished, not as an accusation, but as a husband describing pain he couldn't fix. Alexander listened, then answered honestly. He and Eleanor could not begin a reign built on competing loyalties and old wounds the family had buried but never healed. He admitted the decision had hurt him too. Every choice involving Isabel pulled him back into old family pain, pain the palace had never properly addressed. He didn't call it revenge. He called it protection. Edmund, in a rare moment of vulnerability, admitted he had stayed silent throughout the ordeal not out of weakness, but because he recognized his son wasn't acting from anger. He believed Alexander feared that unresolved loyalties would eventually damage the very institution he was meant to protect. "Then make sure your reign is worth the pain this caused," Edmund finally said. Alexander didn't answer right away. The cost of his decision had finally been spoken aloud, and there was no undoing it now. By morning, the story had moved far beyond the palace walls. Headlines split the image of Alexander and Isabel side by side under bold, dramatic type. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates. Commentators debated whether the young prince had protected the monarchy's future or wounded a woman who had spent years earning her place within it. Eleanor stood beside Alexander as they watched the coverage in silence. She didn't celebrate. She understood more than anyone that public support could still feel like cruelty when it came at someone else's expense. The palace released careful diplomatic language about continuity and future planning, but the public read between the lines. They saw a son stepping out of his father's shadow. They saw a woman pushed further from a future she had once believed she'd share. In the end, nothing about this story was about villains and heroes. Isabel kept her dignity and her place beside Edmund in the present, but her formal role in Alexander's future authority had quietly ended. Edmund had chosen silence, allowing the decision to unfold without ever directly opposing his son. Eleanor had chosen quiet restraint, refusing to let the moment become a victory. And Alexander had chosen the heaviest burden of all, command, and everything it demanded of him. It wasn't a decision made from cruelty. It was made from a belief that old wounds should not be allowed to define a new era. Whether history would remember it as protection or punishment, only time, and the reign that followed, would decide. In the weeks that followed, Ravenscourt Castle settled into an uneasy stillness. The corridors that once echoed with hurried footsteps and whispered court gossip now felt strangely calm. The calm that comes after a storm has already done its damage, and there is nothing left to shout about. Isabel began appearing less frequently at public functions, though she never once complained. She attended a private family gathering shortly after the announcement, and it was her composure, not her protest, that left the deepest impression on those who witnessed it. She entered the room calmly, greeted Edmund with quiet warmth, and did not reach for the central seat that had once seemed within her grasp. It was a small gesture, but everyone in that room understood its weight. Edmund watched her that day with visible pain etched across his face. He had spent decades learning that a crown could take many things from a person, but he hadn't expected it to take away certainty. Certainty about his own family, about loyalty, about whether love and duty could ever be separated cleanly. Watching his wife carry her reduced role with such grace made him realize that dignity, unlike influence, could not be legislated away. Alexander stood at the far end of the room that evening, no longer the uncertain heir waiting nervously for his future to take shape. Something in him had shifted permanently. He was no longer just anticipating the crown, he had begun actively shaping what it would become. Edmund noticed the change immediately. His son had crossed some invisible threshold from patience into command, and there was no going back. Eleanor remained steady throughout it all, refusing to let the moment become anything resembling triumph. She never treated Isabel's diminished role as a victory for herself, and she made a quiet point of showing kindness toward the queen consort whenever the opportunity arose, not out of obligation, but because she understood something Alexander was only beginning to learn, that power taken without compassion eventually corrodes the person who holds it. Her calm presence became, in many ways, the emotional center of the family's next chapter. Where there had once been rivalry and unspoken resentment, she offered something steadier, not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace that allowed the family to function without pretending the wound had never happened. Alexander's reasoning, when he finally spoke about it privately to those closest to him, was simple enough. He hadn't stripped Isabel of her future role to humiliate her. He had done it because he believed, deeply and perhaps painfully, that inherited resentments could not be allowed to quietly govern a monarchy that hadn't even begun yet. He chose to absorb the discomfort of the present rather than risk confusion and division decades later, when the stakes would be far higher and far less forgiving. The verdict, in the end, was neither cruel nor kind, simply final. Isabel remained respected within the family, but she no longer stood at the center of what Alexander was building. Edmund accepted what his own silence had already permitted, understanding that sometimes a father's greatest act of love is knowing when not to interfere. Eleanor became the calm anchor of the next generation, and Alexander stopped waiting for stability to arrive on its own. He began building it himself, one difficult decision at a time, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that a crown is never just inherited. It is shaped, wound by wound, choice by choice, until it finally belongs to the one who carries it.